In December 1944, as snow buried the forests of the Ardennes and freezing fog swallowed entire divisions, German commanders believed they had finally found the moment they had been waiting for. The Western Front was quiet. American units were stretched thin. Supplies were low. Morale, they assumed, was weaker than ever. What they could not know, was that a silent technological revolution had already arrived on the battlefield. The Battle of the Bulge would not only be decided by tanks, infantry, or courage. It would be decided in the air by an invention so secret that even many Allied soldiers had no idea it existed. An invention that turned ordinary artillery shells into invisible executioners. The proximity fuse. When the German offensive exploded forward on December 16th, American lines buckled under the weight of surprise. Entire regiments were overrun. Roads clogged with refugees, retreating vehicles, and shattered equipment. German commanders watched with satisfaction as their armored spearheads punched deep into Allied territory. They believed American artillery was predictable. They believed if their troops stayed dispersed, moved quickly, and avoided obvious targets, they could survive the shelling. They were wrong. For decades, artillery had followed simple rules. A shell either struck the ground, hit an object, or exploded after a preset time. Skilled troops learned how to avoid its worst effects. They deeper foxolis. Spread out. Move fast. The proximity fuse shattered every one of those assumptions. Inside the nose of these shells was a tiny radar transmitter, miniaturized to survive the violence of being fired from a gun. As the shell descended, it emitted radio waves. When those waves bounced back from anything below, soldiers, vehicles, even snow-covered ground, the fuse triggered instantly. The shell did not explode on impact. It exploded in the air, directly above its target. The first German units to encounter this weapon had no warning. They heard the familiar whistle of incoming artillery and reacted as they always had, diving into foxholes, flattening themselves against the frozen earth. Then the sky itself seemed to tear open. Shells detonated overhead, spraying fragments downward in lethal cones. Shrapnel did not skim the ground. It plunged straight into trenches. Foxholes became traps. Snowfields turned into killing zones. Entire platoons were shredded in seconds. German survivors would later describe it as fighting an enemy that could see them even when they were hidden. An enemy that struck with perfect timing every time. Officers tried to adapt. They ordered their men to move at night. They ordered faster advances. They ordered tighter formations to maintain control in the snow and fog. Each adjustment only made the effect worse. Proximity fuse shells were devastating against moving troops. A marching column presented dozens of targets at once. A single barrage could wipe out an entire company before anyone understood what was happening. Reports began reaching German headquarters describing impossible losses. Units that had not been directly engaged by American infantry were simply vanishing. Advances stalled, not because of resistance, but because formations were being erased from the battlefield. At first, German commanders suspected a new type of mine, or massed airburst artillery coordinated by spotters. They did not yet understand the truth. The proximity fuse was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Developed jointly by American and British scientists, it had taken years to perfect. Early versions detonated too early. Others failed under the acceleration of firing. Many simply didn't work. By 1944, those problems were solved, and the Allies had waited for the perfect moment to use it. The Ardennes. American artillery units received strict orders. Proximity fuse shells were to be used only under specific conditions. If unexploded shells were recovered, they were to be destroyed immediately. Nothing could fall into enemy hands. The effect was immediate and terrifying. German troops advancing through forest clearings were caught mid-stride by airbursts that tore through ranks. Mortar teams setting up positions were obliterated before firing a single round. Infantry hugging tree lines found branches exploding into splinters and steel. Even armored units were affected. While tanks themselves were resistant, the infantry supporting them, the lifeline of any armored advance, was annihilated. Without infantry, tanks became blind. And blind tanks die. German radio traffic became increasingly desperate. Units requested artillery support that never came. Commanders demanded explanations. Something was wrong. Something had changed. By the third day of the offensive, the momentum was already slipping away. The Germans had planned for American resistance. They had not planned for American science. And as the snow continued to fall, the forests of the Ardennes became a graveyard, not of tanks, but of men who never saw what killed them. This was only the beginning, because once the Germans realized what they were facing, it was already too late. By December 1944, the forests of the Ardennes were silent in a way that felt unnatural. Snow absorbed sound, thick clouds blocked the moon, and freezing fog rolled between the trees. To German commanders, this silence felt like opportunity. They believed the Americans were exhausted, stretched thin, and unprepared for a winter offensive. What they did not know was that hidden behind that silence was a technological shift that would change the battlefield forever. For months, Allied artillery units had been quietly training with a weapon so secret that many frontline soldiers didn't even know how it truly worked. It wasn't louder than normal shells. It didn't look different when loaded. But once fired, it carried inside it a small electronic brain that would decide exactly when to kill. This was the proximity fuse. Before its introduction, artillery depended on either impact or timed explosions. Shells buried themselves in mud or detonated too early or too late. Infantry learned how to survive them. German troops had mastered dispersal tactics, spacing themselves just enough to reduce casualties. They trusted that if they stayed low and kept moving, they could endure almost anything artillery threw at them. That confidence would soon be shattered. As German armored columns pushed through the Ardennes, they advanced in tight formations along narrow forest roads. Tanks, half-tracks, and infantry moved together, trying to punch through American lines before air power could respond. Snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft, just as German planners had hoped. What they hadn't planned for was American artillery firing shells that did not need to hit the ground to kill. The first engagements were confusing. German troops reported explosions above their heads. Shrapnel came down like metal rain, slicing through helmets, shoulders, and exposed flesh. Soldiers dove into foxholes that offered no protection from fragments exploding in the air. Entire squads were cut down in seconds. Officers shouted orders, trying to make sense of what was happening. Some believed they were under airburst bombing. Others thought American aircraft had somehow penetrated the storm. But there were no planes, only shells, and they were detonating perfectly every time. Inside American fire control centers, artillery crews watched their calculations pay off. The proximity fuse used a tiny radio transmitter that sent signals downward. When a signal bounced back from the ground, the fuse knew exactly how high it was. At the optimal height, often just 20 to 30 feet above the target, the shell exploded. The effect was devastating. Shrapnel spread outward and downward, covering a lethal cone far wider than any ground burst. Infantry caught in the open had no chance. Even those behind light cover were struck by fragments descending from above. German formations that once moved with discipline dissolved into chaos. Radio reports flooded headquarters. Entire platoons wiped out without warning. Advancing units halted, unsure how to proceed. The snow that had once concealed movement now revealed dark stains spreading across white fields. Some German officers suspected a new weapon but couldn't identify it. Others accused American gunners of extraordinary luck. But luck does not repeat itself with mathematical precision. Each barrage was worse than the last. Artillery that once suppressed, now annihilated. American gunners adjusted fire rapidly, walking explosions across advancing columns. Vehicles were disabled not by direct hits, but by shrapnel shredding exposed crews and damaging optics and radios. For the first time, German soldiers feared artillery more than air attack. Veterans later described the psychological impact as unbearable. You couldn't hear the shell coming. You couldn't predict where it would land. And you couldn't hide from something that exploded above you. Men froze in place, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat. The Ardennes offensive relied on speed. Proximity fuses stole that speed away. Every delay allowed American reinforcements to arrive. Every shattered unit weakened the momentum of the attack. German commanders began ordering troops to spread out, but forest roads made dispersion impossible. Columns remained compressed, perfect targets for airburst fire. Meanwhile, American confidence grew. Artillery officers who had once rationed shells now fired aggressively, knowing each round counted for far more than before. Forward observers reported unprecedented kill rates. Some units claimed more casualties inflicted in days than entire previous campaigns. Behind the scenes, Allied scientists listened carefully to battlefield reports. The weapon they feared might malfunction in winter conditions was performing flawlessly. Cold temperatures did not disrupt the fuses. Snow did not confuse their sensors. The system worked exactly as designed. German intelligence eventually identified the cause, but by then it was too late. Attempts to jam the signal failed. The fuse frequency was unknown and constantly shifting. Captured shells were rare and often damaged. Even when examined, the technology was so advanced that replicating it during wartime was impossible. The balance had shifted. What began as a surprise offensive turned into a slow, grinding collapse. German units that survived the initial barrages were exhausted, demoralized, and under constant threat. Every time artillery fire was called in, soldiers braced for death from the sky. The Ardennes no longer felt like cover. It felt like a trap. And as the winter battle raged on, proximity fuses continued to do what no other weapon had done so effectively: erase entire formations in seconds, without warning, without mercy. The Germans had prepared for tanks, planes, and bullets. They had not prepared for shells that thought for themselves. By the time winter fully gripped the Ardennes Forest, German commanders believed they had solved the problem of American artillery. Snow, fog, and dense tree cover had always limited air power, and traditional artillery relied on precise ground impact. German troops learned to dig deeper, spread out, and wait for shells to bury themselves harmlessly in frozen soil. But what the Germans did not know was that something entirely new had entered the battlefield. American gunners were no longer trying to hit the ground. They were aiming for the air itself. When the first shells detonated above German infantry formations, the reaction was confusion. Soldiers instinctively threw themselves flat, expecting fragments to pass overhead. Instead, steel rained downward with lethal precision. Shrapnel did not skim the ground. It fell straight into trenches, foxholes, and open vehicle compartments. Entire squads vanished in seconds. German officers initially believed they were under airburst attack from aircraft. Reports flooded headquarters, claiming American planes were somehow operating through the clouds. Others suspected a new kind of rocket weapon. None of the explanations fit what they were seeing. There was no warning sound. No di la explosión. The shells simply burst in the air at the exact height needed to kill. What made the effect even more terrifying was its consistency. Traditional timed fuses could fail in cold weather. Mechanical delays froze. Calculations went wrong. But these new American shells exploded with eerie reliability, regardless of temperature, snow, or terrain. German formations that had survived years on the Eastern Front were suddenly being destroyed in minutes. An advancing infantry company could be reduced to scattered survivors before they even saw the American lines. Half-tracks erupted in fire without a direct hit. Machine gun teams were eliminated while still concealed. Officers fell at the same rate as enlisted men, leaving units leaderless and disorganized. For the first time in the campaign, German troops began avoiding open movement entirely, even when ordered to advance. Captured soldiers spoke of shells that thought for themselves. Some claimed the Americans had found a way to guide artillery using radar on every round. Others whispered that it was impossible to fight an enemy who could explode the sky. The truth was both simpler and more devastating. Inside each shell was a proximity fuse, a tiny radio transmitter and receiver capable of sensing the presence of the ground or nearby objects. When a reflected signal returned at the correct strength, the shell detonated instantly. No clock, no impact, no escape. This meant that even perfectly dug-in soldiers were no longer safe. The forests of the Ardennes, once protection against artillery, became death traps. Tree bursts multiplied the lethal effect, spraying fragments horizontally and downward. German troops later described the sound as continuous tearing, like the forest itself was being shredded. Attempts to adapt failed quickly. Spreading out only made coordination impossible under heavy fire. Digging deeper offered no protection against fragments descending from above. Armored columns halted when lead vehicles were disabled without visible cause. Medics could not reach the wounded without being cut down themselves. Morale collapsed faster than ammunition supplies. German commanders, veterans of blitzkrieg and mechanized warfare, were forced into defensive paralysis. Units that should have broken through American lines instead froze in place, pinned by invisible explosions. Time, critical for the German offensive, was lost hour by hour. American artillery officers, observing from their fire direction centers, realized they were witnessing a turning point. Kill rates increased dramatically. Ammunition expenditure dropped because fewer rounds were needed. Fire missions that once required careful adjustment now achieved devastating results almost immediately. One U.S. officer later remarked that proximity fuses did not merely improve artillery. They transformed it into something closer to a battlefield executioner. By the end of this phase of the battle, German intelligence finally understood what was happening. But understanding did not mean countering. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, electronics expertise, and time to replicate or neutralize the technology. The advantage was absolute. What began as a surprise soon became a certainty. Any large German formation that moved within range of American artillery faced near destruction. The Battle of the Bulge was no longer just a contest of armor and infantry. It had become a demonstration of what industrial science could do to massed armies. And the Germans had just learned, too late, that the Americans had turned physics itself into a weapon. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a breaking point. Snow covered the forests of the Ardennes, freezing engines, stiffening fingers, and slowing every movement on the battlefield. German commanders believed this weather would shield them. Allied aircraft were grounded. Visibility was poor. Artillery fire was unreliable. To the Germans, this was the perfect moment to strike. They launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive surprise offensive aimed at splitting Allied lines and forcing a negotiated peace. Columns of German infantry and armor pushed forward through narrow roads and dense forests, confident that Allied defenses were thin and vulnerable. What they did not know was that the balance of the battlefield had already shifted. Hidden inside Allied artillery shells was a technology so secret that even many American gunners did not fully understand it. It was small, no larger than a light bulb, but it would change the outcome of ground warfare forever. The proximity fuse. Traditional artillery relied on timing or impact. A shell either hit the ground or exploded after a preset delay. In forests like the Ardennes, that meant shells often buried themselves harmlessly in snow or dirt, wasting their explosive power. German troops had learned to survive artillery by hugging the ground, using trees and terrain as protection. The proximity fuse destroyed that logic. Instead of waiting to hit the ground, these new shells detonated in midair. They sensed the presence of an object beneath them and exploded at precisely the right moment, showering fragments downward with terrifying efficiency. In the snow-covered forests, this meant explosions above treetop level, sending steel shards raining straight into foxholes and trenches. The first time German formations encountered this new fire, confusion spread instantly. Soldiers dove for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. Trees no longer protected them. Snow offered no safety. Entire squads were cut down without ever seeing what had hit them. German officers initially believed they were facing a new type of weapon, perhaps a secret Allied rocket or aircraft-delivered bomb. Reports flooded up the chain of command, describing artillery that burst in the air and killed men who were well dug in. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front admitted they had never experienced anything like it. On the American side, artillery units were ordered to conserve these shells for critical moments. They knew their value. When German attacks masked for assaults, proximity fuse barges were unleashed with devastating effect. Advancing formations were shattered before they reached Allied lines. At Bastogne and along key defensive positions, proximity fuses turned American artillery into an invisible wall of death. German infantry attacks stalled. Morale dropped. Survivors spoke of shells that seemed to think, exploding exactly where soldiers try to hide. This was not luck. It was science, secrecy, and industrial power working together. The Germans quickly realized they were losing men at an unsustainable rate. Units that should have broken through instead disintegrated under artillery fire that could not be countered or avoided. Even armored columns suffered as supporting infantry was wiped out, leaving tanks isolated and vulnerable. The Ardennes offensive slowed. Momentum vanished. And with every failed assault, the truth became clearer to German commanders. The Allies were fighting a different kind of war now. One where technology amplified firepower beyond anything Germany could match. What had begun as a bold gamble was turning into a disaster, not just because of American resistance, but because of a weapon the Germans never saw coming, exploding silently above their heads in the frozen air. By the winter of 1944, German commanders believed they understood Allied artillery. They had survived years of bombardment across Europe. They knew how shells behaved. They knew when to take cover. They knew when explosions meant safety and when they meant death. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that understanding suddenly failed. As German infantry and armor pushed forward through snow-covered roads, something felt wrong. Artillery bursts were happening too high. Shells were not hitting the ground. There were no craters, no warning impacts, no chance to die flat and survive. Instead, explosions bloomed in the air. Entire platoons were cut down without ever seeing the shell that killed them. The reason was a technology the Germans had dismissed as unreliable, the proximity fuse. Unlike traditional artillery fuses that detonated on impact or after a time delay, these new shells exploded when they sensed an object nearby. The shell did not need to hit the ground. It did not need to strike a tank. It simply needed to pass close enough to a human body, a vehicle, or even a line of advancing troops. And then it detonated. Thousands of steel fragments spread downward in a lethal cone, perfectly designed to kill exposed infantry. Soldiers lying prone were no longer safe. Foxholes offered little protection. Even those hugging the frozen earth found themselves torn apart from above. German officers quickly realized something terrifying. Their formations were being erased in seconds. Units advancing in columns were shredded before they could scatter. Anti-aircraft guns were useless. Infantry tactics that had worked since World War I no longer mattered. The shells were exploding exactly where soldiers thought they were safest. Reports from the front lines became frantic. Men spoke of invisible weapons, of shells that thought before exploding, of artillery that hunted instead of falling. The psychological effect was devastating. Veteran troops froze in place, unsure whether movement or cover increased their chances of survival. Morale collapsed. Attacks stalled, not because of resistance, but because soldiers no longer trusted the battlefield itself. What made the situation worse was that Germany could not respond in kind. The technology behind proximity fuses was astonishingly complex. Each fuse contained miniature electronics, vacuum tubes, and power sources capable of surviving the violent acceleration of artillery fire. German scientists had underestimated American industrial capacity and precision manufacturing. They simply could not build them fast enough. In many cases, they could not build them at all. For the first time, German commanders faced a weapon they could not counter, could not copy, and could not escape. Artillery had always been about mathematics and timing. Now it was about detection and inevitability. As Allied guns continued to fire, German formations learned a brutal lesson. The air above them was no longer empty space. It was a killing zone, and at the Battle of the Bulge, that realization came too late. By the final weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, the German army no longer feared Allied numbers alone. What haunted them was something invisible. Bursts of air that arrived without warning, detonations that ignored trenches, foxholes, and cover. The proximity fuse had turned the sky itself into a weapon. German infantry had survived artillery before. They had learned to hug the ground, to read the sound of incoming shells, to trust that if they were not directly hit, they might live. That instinct betrayed them in December 1944. Shells now exploded above them, perfectly timed, shredding formations that never saw the impact coming. Veterans later said it felt as if the Americans had learned how to make lightning explode. The psychological collapse was immediate. Units that had advanced confidently days earlier began refusing to move in daylight. Officers reported entire companies breaking apart after a single barrage. Survivors spoke of bodies lifted from the ground, of steel fragments raining downward like blades, of screams cut short mid-sentence. No defensive doctrine existed for this kind of fire. No amount of bravery could stop it. What made the situation worse for German commanders was that they did not understand why it was happening. Their intelligence officers suspected new radar, new observers, even sabotage. They did not know that a tiny electronic device, smaller than a light bulb, was making every shell think for itself. American artillery crews, meanwhile, had absolute confidence. Gun captains knew their rounds no longer needed perfect accuracy. Near misses were now lethal. Fire missions that once required hundreds of shells now needed only dozens. Entire forest lines were stripped bare in seconds. German counterattacks dissolved before they could even form. At Bastogne, at Elsenborn Ridge, along frozen roads choked with armor, proximity-fused shells shattered German momentum again and again. Tanks lost their infantry screens. Assault waves vanished under airbursts. Survivors froze in place, terrified to move, terrified to dig in, terrified even to breathe too loudly. After the war, German generals finally learned the truth. They learned that the Allies had fielded a weapon they never managed to deploy and combat themselves. They learned that American industry had not only invented it, but manufactured it by the millions, tested it in secrecy, and trusted it completely. One German artillery officer later said, "We were no longer fighting men. We were fighting mathematics." The Battle of the Bulge did not end because of one weapon alone. But proximity fuses accelerated its outcome. They broke formations faster, saved Allied lives, and turned desperate German offensives into slaughter. The last gamble of the Third Reich ran headfirst into a future it could not match. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, the war changed forever. From that moment on, no army would ever again assume that the sky above them was empty. And the German soldiers who survived carried that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. That sometimes the deadliest enemy is the one you cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot escape.